morning. My name is Sam Rafalidis. I'm professor of political science and history at the TNEC campus, Fairleigh Dickinson University, and director of its Global Scholars Program. I thank Ambassador Kamal for arranging this, and thank you, Ambassador Ayatoklios, for joining us. And we're delighted to hear from you on this important topic, unfolding events in Egypt, their impact on the Middle East and beyond. I welcome our three external sites, Bronx Community College, Lehigh University, and Mercy College, and also our sister campuses, Vancouver and the college at Florham. The format will be the same as usual. Ambassador Kamal and Ambassador Ayatoklios will discuss the topic for approximately 30 minutes or so, and then we'll go around to each site for 2 questions from each campus. If we have time, we'll go around a second time and 4 more questions. Without further delay, the floor is yours, Ambassador Kamal.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to have Ambassador Agathokleos with us. Ambassador Agathokleos is the former permanent representative of Cyprus at the United Nations, but far more importantly, he is a pillar of wisdom and intellectual study about events and about the United Nations system. He also happens to be the person who envisioned and negotiated the entry of Cyprus into the European Union, and has therefore been following events in Europe, not just between Cyprus and the European Union, but also between Cyprus and Turkey, and therefore with the Middle East. And so we are delighted, sir, to have an expert of this depth with us. May I shake hands with you? Thank you. Let me lead into the subject myself, with your permission. We are at an undoubted, decisive point in history. What is happening in the Middle East is a landmark event, and therefore it behooves us to analyze it in depth to understand what exactly is happening and how is it spreading and where will it end. So this is really not about Egypt alone. It is about an event which has a snowball effect and which is decisive. And so all of us are extremely lucky to be alive in front of an event of this magnitude and to be able to be living participants in something of such importance. It is not often that you participate in this type of a historic event from such close quarters. My suggestion to you, Ambassador Agathokleos, is that we divide our part into 2 parts. The first is to try to see what are the facts of the case. And having established the facts, then to move into a second part, which is to try to establish an analysis of what is happening. And if you agree, that is how we will go. Now, my understanding of the facts are the following. It started in Tunisia. It started with one man setting himself on fire. And that started a reaction in Tunisia, which then spread into Egypt. And Egypt is totally different from Tunisia. Tunisia is an important but a small country. Egypt is a large country with a huge population of 80 million and an intellectual and physical center of the Arab world. This is an old country, and therefore it has a radiation which goes throughout the Middle East and well beyond. And so events in Egypt are far more important than events in Tunisia alone. And so from Egypt, this reaction, whatever it is, spreads further. And it goes into Jordan, into Yemen, into Libya, into Bahrain, into Morocco, into Iran, and even further afield into the United States in Wisconsin. All of this is part of a similar event, namely of a public reaction to an authoritarian governmental decision. And so, in all the cases, there are some common points. There is deep frustration of educated youth. It is relatively younger people, all the way from 20-year-olds to 45, 50-year-olds, who are reacting because of a deep frustration, which part of which is economic, either joblessness or absence of participation in sharing the fruits of economic development. Part of the frustration is because of the reaction against long-term authoritarianism. In Egypt, it was 30 years. In Tunisia, it was 30 years. In Libya, it is 40 years. In Bahrain, it is 250 years. And so in all these cases, the reaction is to the long-term status quo and the feeling that people would rather have change than status quo. In all cases, the frustration has been demonstrated peacefully. In other words, there is peaceful non-violence in the frustration. The violence which comes from the reaction of the state, not from the people who are protesting. And so, in all cases, the governmental reaction has been brutal and authoritarian. In some cases, terribly brutal, as in Libya, where aircraft have been used to bomb at the protesters from the air, and that we had never seen anywhere else before. And finally, in all cases, the frustration and the protest in the street is leaderless. In other words, there are no icons standing up and saying, I have a dream. No such thing. It is headless and leaderless, and yet it is very widespread. Would you, Ambassador Agathocleus, agree with me on the facts?
I do agree, but I would like to add a few points you like. Apart from the autocracy that has been the norm in all these countries, and therefore the lack of freedom for the people, and torture, the basic factor was fear of the regime. There have been cases before when people took their grievances to the streets, but they were suppressed and they were disappointed. And there was this fear. The question arises, why, when you had all these underlying factors for years, there was no revolution before, and you had a revolution now? Whether in Tunisia or Egypt. The reasons are a lot and complicated, but let me mention a few. One is that, as you say, these countries have a young population. For example, Egypt, the mean age is 24 years, which means over 50% of the people are below 24 years old. It's usually the case in the other Arab countries. These people, in the last few years, had the media, the social media at their disposal. And they could see what was going on in the world, and they could talk to each other, both inside their own country and outside. So the role of the social media is very important. It was not accidental that you had the revolution in Egypt. There was some organization between some young people in Egypt and Tunisia and in the rest of the Arab world. Another point I would like to mention is what they call the Obama factor. These young people in all these Arab countries saw a young man, African American, coming from a dysfunctional, more or less dysfunctional family, alone, and through his perseverance and intelligence, he managed to inspire the whole United States and eventually the world, and get over the leadership of the United States and be the leader of the world. That was a great inspiration to a lot of people throughout the world, especially the oppressed. If he could do it, they could do it. Secondly, one of his first travels abroad was Egypt. And there he said, in very clear terms, that governments should rule with the consent of the people. Without the consent, they cannot rule. And they have to respect the rights of the people, their human rights, and their dignity. This was very exciting for people, and it gave them hope. Hope is very important. And then you got the spark in Tunisia, and that in a way humiliated the Egyptians because, as you said before, Egypt was the epicenter of the Arab world. It is a big country, and a country of 5,000 years of civilization, and they were, in a way, sorry and humiliated that they didn't have a revolution and the Tunisians did. So, but they also realized that it could be done, because 2 days after the revolution in Tunisia, the leadership fell. Another point I would like to mention is the role of the army. Ironically, the army that had been used and has been used to suppress people in Tunisia from the second day turned against the regime and sided with the protesters. We saw that happening after a few days in Egypt. That's very important. And it's also very important as to how things will develop in those two countries and in the rest of the Arab world. As you mentioned, certain regimes other than Egypt and Tunisia reacted differently. Like, for example, as you mentioned, Libya, which decided to suppress brutally their own people. It also happened in Bahrain, but eventually they decided to withdraw their tanks from the streets. I don't know how things will develop, but the regime has cracked. Similarly, in Libya, they have no legitimacy anymore. Let us also mention another very important issue that has been behind the frustration of the Arab people, and that is the Palestinian issue. For years, the Palestinians were fighting, they were suppressed, they negotiated, but no end to the occupation and setting up a new state. The Arab masses and the young were disappointed by that. And although Egypt, the Egyptian leadership decided that they could not fight any more wars with Israel, and therefore the only way was to have an agreement and partnership, yet the ordinary people realized that they didn't go far enough. And they allowed, for example, the suppression of Palestinian people, especially in the Gaza Strip, where Egypt, the regime, was seen by the people as participating in the siege of the Palestinian people of Gaza. So, behind all political activity in all Arab countries was this frustration of allowing their governments not to give the overwhelming support that they should be giving to the Palestinian issue. Some of the Arab states had a lot of money and they were throwing it away in grandiose projects and for continuing solidifying their regime, but not going far enough to support the Palestinian issue and get that out of their lives. So it was no wonder that the spark in Tunisia caught Egypt, and it's now spreading throughout the Arab world. And as you say, even beyond. We saw the protests in Wisconsin using the success in the streets of Egypt in their protests. If the Egyptians could do it, why couldn't we do it? Why couldn't we extract from the government our rights? Why are they going to take the rights of the trade unions away, or for bargaining away, after so many years and so many fights in the 20th century and until now? So these are my preliminary points, if you like, and we'll come back to some of them later.
Thank you very much. That's a deep analysis that you have already done. Let me just one more word. I think the most important, one of the most important elements of the youth movement and why they revolted now and not before is that they thought that their pride has been taken away and their dignity. These are the two most important words that everybody interviewed on television were saying. Our pride, our dignity. And now, after we won, we believe we are worth something. That's very important, and it cannot be taken away. And this will be the element that would allow them to set up a new regime. Yes, but then that is what makes it extremely important, because the center of gravity has shifted. The center of gravity was being run. The frustration was whether it was joblessness or whether it was search for freedom. The common point between the two is the question of what is called governance. In other words, governance was poor, but people had accepted it. People were living with bad governance or questionable governance for 40 years, 50 years, 200 years, or whatever. And that means that people, by and large, will accept the status quo for a long, long time, until the last straw on the camel's back, makes them stand up and say, basta, enough. And so a point was reached where the status quo was no longer acceptable to the vast masses. But now this extraordinary change puts all of us in an extremely difficult position, particularly the United States, because we have been following a policy in the Middle East. We have been supporting the people who were ensuring bad governance. They were our allies. And therefore, if we were supporting them, then we are colluding with bad governance from this end. And so all of us become guilty of the history of poor governance in the Middle East and beyond. We haven't touched Latin America yet, but you have similar positions in Latin America. There are similar positions in other places in Asia, in Central Asia and beyond. And so, quite obviously, the role that we have played in the past is also going to be questioned and is also going to come to an end. And so, how do you see that the evolution of the role of the external powers, Europe, United States, etc., in the face of this type of a change, which affects the vital interests of the external powers? The external powers have a vital interest, for example, in oil. The external powers have a vital interest in stability and the status quo. And all of that has been upset. Oil today is $107. And so, how are we going to react to this type of a situation? And are we guilty of part of the lead up to this revolutionary wind which is now sweeping across the Middle East? Back to you, sir.
The West is guilty of pursuing their interests blindly and supporting these regimes. There is no question. The question is, are they willing to change that policy, and how?
They don't have to be willing. I mean, they'll have to change it willy-nilly.
Well, I say how.
Their allies are gone, one by one.
That's why I say how. We have seen, to his credit, President Obama sensed that he didn't do enough after his speech in Cairo. And when the events started there, he came on television and he supported the rights of the people and their aspirations and their dignity, and appealed to the regime not to use force against them. And behind the scenes, used his influence to ask for a change. And ask for a change. And the change happened. Now, how are they going to do it in the future? And what are they going to do in other countries? The question is, how much direct influence do they have? I say direct. Indirect they have. Direct, I don't know, especially immediately and when events are folding. They have to reconcile to the new facts of the situation, and that is they have to cooperate and help the creation of a civil society in all these countries and the civil government. And although it might be messy for a while, eventually it will be the best cooperation they could have and the biggest stability they could have than relying on dictators and people who did not have the support of their own people. And they should enter into cooperation with all of these countries through their governments, through civic societies, support civic societies, but also support the economic and social development of these countries. Both the United States and the European Union. The European Union has for years had a policy which they call the Mediterranean policy. Eventually, they called it a community, a Mediterranean community, a community between the Mediterranean countries that included all the Arab countries, Israel, and on the one hand, and Europe on the other hand. But they, although they put some money into it as well, and projects, common projects, they did not possibly put that much into it as they should. But I am sure that they are going to use these instruments in the future. And I hope that the United States will do the same, although one can see that the opposition to the administration here wants to cut foreign aid at this particular time when they should be talking about increasing it fundamentally and going into cooperation with these countries.
Yes, but I want to ask you very specifically. The Western interests in the Middle East are based on oil at a cheap price and an insurance policy for oil which is at cheap price, and that insurance policy is called Israel.
Yes.
Now, both of these are being threatened by the change.
Yes.
And so the question is, how are you going to react to a rise in oil prices, which is not sustainable by Western industry, and a collapse of the policy of Israel, because Israel is described not as an ally, but a strategic ally. And the word strategic means oil.
Yeah.
And now that will not be sustainable either, because once you have democracy throughout the Middle East, then people will revolt and will ask for. Remember that in the case of Egypt, one of the main criticisms of the people in Egypt against Mr. Mubarak was that he was collaborating with Israel, particularly in Gaza, and that Gaza had been converted into a concentration camp jointly by Egypt and Israel. And so now that policy will no longer be sustainable. And so my question is, if you were the President of the United States, what is the change that you would make? Or the President of France, or the Chancellor of Germany, what is the change that you would make in order to adjust to this wind of change? And the reason why I'm asking this is because my suspicion is that you will try to set up military powers in all these countries. In other words, you will try to replace the fallen dictators with new strongmen, all coming from the army in these countries, in Tunisia, in Egypt, in elsewhere. And if so, that is not democracy then. That is replacement of one dictatorship by another dictatorship. Back to you, sir.
Yeah, very important questions. As you know, I mentioned the Palestinian issue in my statement before, and I come back to it now. I believe that the most important fallout of these developments, not only that it spreads in the other countries, but the most important fallout will be the Palestinian issue. And therefore, I would expect, and I think we are going to see, that both the United States and Europe will try, and they will have more persuading powers now, to persuade Israel to come to an agreement and solve, at long last, the Palestinian issue. As we all know, they have been talking for years now on this issue, and all the elements of the solution are known. People who are negotiating know, and where they are and where they can go, and they are very close. Even Prime Minister, a previous Prime Minister of Israel, Omer, said that we are very, very close, and in fact, he was planning to have an agreement by last September and present it to the UN. But in the meantime, his government fell. He fell out of power because he was involved in scandals. Anyway, the question is, there will be a strong, very, very strong effort by all parties of the world, but mainly the United States and Europe, supported by Russia and other interested countries, to resolve the Palestinian issue. That, by itself, if that is solved, will take away all the frustrations and all the excuses of the Arab world and the rest of not making changes and relying on so-called stability. And because now they realize that through a solution of the Palestinian issue, then there is no threat of Hamas, for example, or Hezbollah will not be there because they are supposedly fighting and reacting against their occupation of Palestine. If you remove that, then you also remove the influence of Iran, which is supporting these elements. And Iran is also sustaining an anti-Western, anti-American policy. If you take the Palestinian issue out of the equation, then their arguments are weakened. And they will be having more peaceful relations both with the Arab countries. Now they don't, because these Arab countries have been used because of the Palestinian issue, because of oil.
No, we've lost him.
Sorry.
Yeah, we're back again. Go ahead.
Because of the Palestinian issue, because of oil, Iran, for example, had this anti-American, anti-Western position, and they were the ones that they said, and they appeared to the people on the spot that they were the only real supporters of the rights of the Palestinian people. But if you take that out of the situation, then you have a completely different picture. You have Israel at peace with the Palestinians, with its neighbors, cooperating openly and not using them like they used Egypt to perpetuate the status quo. So you also saw that even if the Americans or the West try to replace, as you say, one strong military man with another, they might fail. In fact, we saw the developments of the Egyptian situation. At first, you had statements saying, well, Suleiman would take over and he will guide the new transition. He only lasted for a couple of days because the people could not take it anymore. You had to have real change. Now, what is going to happen in Egypt and in the rest of the Arab world, as far as the new regime is concerned, I cannot tell you for sure, but inevitably it's going to go towards a freer, democratic society with civil institutions, both governmental and private, and where the rule of law, where real a free judicial system will replace the suppression regimes that we had before. What kind of government you're going to have, we don't know. But we have examples. For example, you had a change in Korea after a revolt in the 80s. And you had a transition to democracy. You had a revolt in Indonesia. Again, you had a transition to democracy. Not the Western democracy that we know, but a democracy and participation by the people in elections, even Islamic parties. In fact, the Indonesian example might be a very good example to follow closely with regard to Egypt.
Let us open it out to questions from our audience, starting with Bronx Community College. 2 questions, please, from Bronx. We'll be answering them together. Over to Bronx.
Good morning. My name is Halima Tuba. I'm an accounting major here at Bronx Community College. The question I had concerns Libya. With all the interest of the Western world in the Libyan region, with the oil production that we know of, do you think there's a possibility of a UN intervention in Libya if Gaddafi refuses to step out and continues to introduce these Western people?
The question is, I've understood the question. Let's take the second question.
UN intervention?
Good morning. My name is Guadalajara, and I'm a student in Bronx Community College. And my question is, how can UN directly or indirectly impose the democracy on the new regimes in Egypt and the other regions? Is it possible now?
Linked. Yeah, both questions are linked. The question really is, can the UN play a role, either through intervention or by pushing democracy in these regions? What is the role of the UN? Would you like
Go ahead.
Oh, you want me to?
No, I can answer. Well, all right, I can
Okay,
make
go
my
ahead.
contribution and you do. I think the UN has problems. The UN can never impose any solution on any country, including my country. We have had a UN peacekeeping operation in Cyprus for the last 40 years, and there is no solution to the Cyprus problem. I'm sorry to say. But the UN can use a moral power through resolutions, for example, and asking governments like Libya now, condemning what they are doing and asking them to bring the situation back to the rule of law and introduce democracy. The UN doesn't have a standing army. So if you are going to have any peacekeeping, and it must be peacekeeping and not peace enforcing, has to be put together by volunteers, by countries volunteering to participate in the force. No, so the UN, my short answer is that the UN cannot impose democracy, unfortunately.
Let me add something. The United Nations is not an international government. Please understand this very clearly. The UN is only a forum where you try to achieve consensus among the member states. That's all that it is. And at the moment in the UN on this particular subject of Egypt, Middle East, Libya, firstly, there is no consensus because there is no army, and therefore before you can deploy any army, you have to have a decision which means consensus in the Security Council, at least 9 votes with all the 5 permanent members on board. It does not exist at the moment. Number 2, by and large, the deployment of peacekeeping forces is based on the concept of consent. The UN is a body in which you have to be a consenting adult before you can go further. And that consent has to be secured from Libya. And Libya does not at the moment have any government. And so, or perhaps tomorrow it will not have any government. So unless there is consent, you will not be able to deploy. On the other hand, there is a new rule of law which has emerged, which is the International Criminal Court. That is to say, personal violations of accepted norms of international behavior. And there is already talk of accusing Colonel Gaddafi of Libya for crimes against humanity, for having bombed his own people. And so that is something which I'm sure will take off slowly over time. But at the moment, the UN role is only, as Ambassador Agathocleos said, a moral role of pushing forward the moral weight of the United Nations. Over to Lehigh for 2 questions. Yes, of course.
When you say, I think it was clear, but let me make it 100% clear. When you talk about consent, you mean for any peacekeeping troops and underline peacekeeping troops and enforcing peace troops. For any of these UN troops to go anywhere, you have to have the consent of the government of that country. And you mentioned, if you don't get the consent of Gaddafi, then you cannot have these forces go to Libya, if you can have any forces.
Over to Lehigh for 2 questions from Lehigh.
Good morning, Mr. Ambassador, and thank you for your presentation. You described the movement in Egypt as leaderless, and so far we haven't seen an agenda from this group either. The Muslim Brotherhood has kind of taken a back seat. Do you see an agenda emerging or a political group emerging to kind of be the face of this movement in Egypt?
Second question.
Hi. How has Facebook and Twitter and other medias played a part in these revolutions? Yeah.
Very good questions, both of them. Can I take them first?
Yes.
The first question of the leaderlessness. There's no doubt that this is what has happened is a true revolution. Revolutions are when the whole mass of people in the street rise up and say enough. And that is what happened. There is no visible leader. The people are trying to become leaders. And from time to time you see them on television. But none of them has been accepted as such. In the West, there was the fear that sooner or later the Muslim Brotherhood would step in. The Muslim Brotherhood is a very old movement in Egypt. It goes back to 1928. And so it's an old movement. But this is not a Muslim Brotherhood movement at all. These are young people. You can see them on television. They are young. They are in their early 20s. None of them have beards. And the best way to spot a Muslim Brotherhood chap is whether there's a beard or not. And you see them, there are no beards. So it's not that the Muslim Brotherhood has taken a back seat. The Muslim Brotherhood has been completely overtaken by the revolution of the youth in all these countries. Now, yet the question is that sooner or later, as Ambassador Agathocleos said, there will be a replacement of this faceless, leaderless revolution by political parties. And so civil society will emerge, and civil society will give way to different political parties. And we do not know what type of political parties will emerge, because in all these cases, the authoritarian governments had taken care to completely suppress and eliminate all political parties. And so you have absolute virgin desert from which these new plants will now emerge. What type of plants they will be, it remains to be seen. Will at least one of them be the people with beards? Possible. But I see that the beards being overtaken by the clean-shaven moderates in most of these countries. Your second question was about Facebook and Twitter, and the expert on that is Ambassador.
No. You are the expert.
There is no doubt that they have played an important role. But do not be under the impression that this is a revolution of Facebook and Twitter. Not at all. Facebook and Twitter were only force multipliers which enabled an existing frustration to spread quicker and better. That's all. That in the absence of television and the internet, the grapevine came into operation, and the grapevine used Twitter and Facebook in order to spread the message. But I don't think that means that with Facebook and Twitter now revolutions are going to occur all over the world. I doubt it. You have to have frustrations for revolutions to occur, not Facebook and Twitter. Yours, sir.
I can only add that to the first question, actually, the leaderless. I think it was an advantage that the revolution in Egypt and Tunisia were leaderless, because they could not be accused by anybody outside or by the government that they had particular aims and that they were just overthrowing the regime. And they just expressed their frustration. But my best scenario that I would hope would happen, for example, in Egypt, would be that they have elections that are free and that different personalities are elected either to the presidency or parliament, and that the government of national reconciliation is formed that allows all walks of life to participate and all shades of political opinions, including the Muslim Brotherhood and the young, and without the military, but have perhaps a national security council that would include one of the militaries to discuss every 6 months or so national security issues. But the rest should be decided and run by a civil government. This is the best scenario that I would hope would happen in Egypt and in Tunisia and in other countries. Whether that will happen, I don't know.
Over to Mercy College for 2 questions, and I will.
Good morning, Dr. Kamal. We've enjoyed this very much. I think the students are shy, but maybe the next time we'll have a question. I have a question. The military rule of Egypt, what I read, that they have total control of the economy in Egypt, that there has never been really encouraging free market. As a matter of fact, they said even Mubarak encouraged a bit of freeing the market, but these people like Tantawi and his group, who are now in charge of the group taking over the military rule in Egypt, are opposed to opening the economy. They have total state control, a la Soviet Union style of taking the economy, and they have a big hold. What I'm asking is, how do you see this going to be this coming year in Egypt? Because this is a big problem. If the military controls the economy of a country, it's very difficult to dislodge them. How do you see that, please? Thank you.
You have a second question.
Anybody?
Sure. Good morning, ambassadors. I'll offer a second question. You have discussed at length the role of the Palestinian issue in recent events, but I'd actually like to challenge you to say a little bit more on that, because the thought that occurs to me is that you have two countries which are among the strongest anti-Israel and pro-Palestinian supporters in the region, which would be Iran and Libya, both of which are seeing riots in the streets. And so it doesn't strike me as that the Palestinian question is very much on the minds of people in those countries. I'd say that you might have a case in the Egypt situation, but even there as well, the history shows that, of course, Gaza was part of Egypt up until 1967, and when efforts were made on the part of the Israeli government to suggest that maybe Egypt would like to take Gaza back, they blanket refused. Now, again, that was under the military regime of Sadat and then Mubarak. Nonetheless, the case remains that there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of support in the Egyptian populace for doing concrete things that would do anything to relieve the plight of Gazan Palestinians. So I leave it with that brief analysis.
Can I take it first?
Okay.
Yeah. 2 points. The first is that of the military and its economic control. I wanted to take this because this is identical to the situation in Pakistan, where we have a very strong military which consumes almost 60% of the budget of Pakistan is spent on defense. In other words, there is a great percentage of importance attached to defense. And it's an identical situation in Egypt. And you know, for example, that the majority of the foreign assistance which Egypt got from the United States, almost $1.5 to $2 billion, almost all of it went to the defense forces. And so, quite obviously, the defense forces are important. Now, what the defense forces then do with the money in their hand is to increase their own salaries and then start buying up different parts of the economy. And so they buy into the insurance companies, they buy into the banking companies, they buy even into the industrial production companies. And over a period of time, the military becomes the owner of a large percentage of the economic life of the country. But this is tenuous. It is tenuous because it is based on the privilege of the military and the acceptance of that privilege by the population. Once that acceptance is challenged by a revolution, as has happened in Egypt, it takes 2 weeks to run the military out of all its ownership of the economy and to bring it back into the hands of the real entrepreneurs rather than the military occupiers, usurpers of the economy. So there's no doubt in my mind that the economy will come back in Egypt and in all these other countries into the hands of the true economic entrepreneurs. On the question of Palestine, please do not be under any misapprehension about the depth of Muslim feelings about Palestine. It is absolutely wrong to believe that the only support to Palestine is coming from Iran and Libya. Support for Palestine is fundamental in all Muslim countries, all the way from Mauritania up to Indonesia. Scratch any Muslim anywhere, not Arab, non-Arab, and you will find that he will give primary importance to the question of justice for the Palestinians. And so when you have a problem of a support of justice on the one side and a support of a impossible status quo on the other side, I'm afraid ultimately justice will prevail. You can hold it back for as long as you want, but ultimately you have to come to terms with a just solution to the problem of the relationship between Israel and Palestine. Over to you, sir.
Yeah, starting from the second point, the Palestinian issue, I agree with you that the Palestinian issue had a pervasive effect in the hearts of all Arab and Muslim countries. The fact that there was not very apparent is because the regimes did not want to take the necessary steps to antagonize other countries that they had relations with, or to take up strong positions. But once these regimes, these military regimes, are out of the way, the ordinary people and the civil governments will start being more assertive towards the solution of the problem. The Arab street will always be there now when you talk about Israel. And therefore, there is going to be much more demands and much more urgency to the solution of the problem. And that will be to the advantage, in a way, ironically, what is happening in the Arab world now might be eventually in favor of Israel. Because for the first time they will be awakened to the fact that they cannot go on with the status quo, and they can get a deal now that they could not get before, or they cannot get certainly in the future, in the very far future, if they don't do anything now. And it will also give them an opportunity to have economic and political and social cooperation with their neighbors, and being an advanced society, they will have a lot of common projects to do with Egypt, Palestine, Syria, Jordan, and the other countries in the region. And they can work through the United European Union as well. Coming to the
I'd like to add one important point, because we had a very interesting event at the United Nations last week, and that was a resolution which was presented in the Security Council against Israeli settlements. Now, this resolution was drafted 100% on the basis of American official statements from the White House and from the State Department. So it was US language that was used in this resolution. And unfortunately, the United States vetoed it. Now that was unfortunate because people will not forget it, that the United States vetoed a resolution on its own language merely because of misplaced loyalty to a strategic ally, namely Israel. People will not forget that easily. And so when we are talking of the winds of change, you have to remember that the quicker you adjust to the problems, the changes that are taking place, the better it is. Yes. If you follow, you will ultimately have to change. That I'm sure of. You can be ahead of the curve or you can be behind the curve. And I'm afraid on this resolution, the United States State Department took a position which was behind the curve with unfortunate consequences.
Let me just say a word here. Let us hope that this will be a leverage by the United States in talking to Israel about the solution as quickly as possible. Now, coming back to the first question about the economic dominance in Egypt, the facts are that 10 to 15% of the economy was in the hands of the military. A lot of the other industries were in the hands of the state, but not the military. But they use that as subsidies to the people, and therefore they are that way buying, in a way, time for them and for the regime to go on. As Ambassador Kamal says, it's a question of decision. It is not very difficult to transfer the economy from state control to the private sector through liberalization. But liberalization in Egypt recently got a bad name, although Mubarak, one of the things to his credit was trying to liberalize some of the state industries. The process was associated with corruption and cronyism, and people from the military circles and friendships and relatives made a lot of money out of that. So the military, not Mubarak and his circle, some people in the military took advantage of that, and they propagated against liberalization and denationalization, if you like.
Over to FDU at Vancouver for two questions from that end. And once again, admiration for Vancouver for getting up so early in the morning to join us for this video session.
Hello, I'm Doug Younger from St. John's School, and what is your prediction for the future of Libya's protests and other countries following on this path? What countries could be next, and do you think that non-Muslim countries such as China will be inspired to revolt?
Hi, my name is Tino. I'm a student here at Federal University. My question is, the US is not very moving towards democracy, supporting it like in Bahrain right now. They're sort of not saying that it's wrong what the government is doing, what the king and the royal family are doing. What do you think is going on in the US? Why aren't they supporting democracy? Isn't that what they're about? Don't they always say that democracy is the correct way for government to run? Why don't they support the people some of the people in the Middle East right now who are trying for a more democratic system in their nations? Thank you.
Please take these first.
This is the second question is a difficult one, and because I cannot read the minds of the people that are discussing these questions now in the State Department or in the White House. The fact is that they are going through an agonizing situation. They know that there is a contradiction between their beliefs and their statements and what they are doing actually. They are not sure whether they can do the right thing at the moment or what exactly they can do. In the question of Bahrain, for example, Bahrain is very, very closely related with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is becoming very jittery about the situation, and therefore they don't know how to do it at the moment, the United States. But they made some statements, I understand, asking the leadership to stop using force against the people on the streets. And the American administration has been credited as having an effect in that the king has ordered the troops to get out of the square. But that, of course, is not good enough. So this is what I can say.
Let me take the questions. You see, the problem, Master Agathokleos has used the word agony, and I think it's a good word to describe the situation in the State Department. The agony is because of the conflict between two distinct concepts, one of which is called belief in democracy, and the other is called interest in stability. Both of these are important, but they are in conflict. democracy means upsetting the status quo. And interest is in perpetuating the status quo. Take the case of Bahrain. Bahrain is home to the Fifth Fleet. It's a vital interest for the United States. Bahrain is also linked to Saudi Arabia by a bridge. The two countries have a common link between them. And so events in Bahrain are going to impact on Saudi Arabia sooner or later. And Saudi Arabia means oil. Saudi Arabia is the only country among the oil producers whose production of oil is elastic. In other words, they can increase or decrease production according to the needs of the day. All the other countries have non-elastic production of oil. So Saudi Arabia is particularly vital. But it will be shaky. It will be shaky because all governments are shaky in the whole band from Mauritania to Indonesia. And so the question is, which way will the ball bounce? In the direction of democracy or in the direction of stability? It looks as if the ball is bouncing in the direction of democracy, which means that we have to adjust to our interests to a new situation, which is no longer a situation of the status quo. One more point to be kept in mind. One of the fallouts from the operation in Iraq was that the Iraq war had to be based on a concept of democracy, meaning that a strongman government had to be replaced by a democratic government. Unfortunately, democratic government in Iraq means allowing the majority to rule. And the majority in Iraq is Shia in its religious conviction. And Shias mean links with Iran. In other words, the fallout of the Iraq operation was an inevitable strengthening of Iran in the Iraq region. Now the same is true of Bahrain. Bahrain is 70% Shia. In other words, any change in Bahrain will ultimately mean an increased presence of Iran in the region. And so what we are watching is not just a growth of democracy, we are also watching an increase in the role of Iran in any future dispensation of the Middle East. Would you like to comment on that?
Following the last point, unless you solve the Palestinian issue where the influence of Iran diminishes. That's why I put a lot of emphasis on that. Another point I would like to mention is that the agonizing in the State Department and Washington generally can be, to the agonizing I can add one more word, and that is the United States, through the experience of the past, is convinced that they cannot be seen to impose a solution on other countries. And that was one of the two main points that Obama made in his Cairo speech a year and a half ago. So in deciding what to do, one option is send a fleet there to occupy Bahrain, for example. Well, they cannot do that. Therefore, they have to use language, words, behind-the-scenes persuasion to get as much on the road to democracy as possible without bloodshed. So it's a very difficult balancing act.
I congratulate Vancouver once again, not only for getting up early in the morning, but also for producing a room that is full of students, as far as I can see, of all ages and sizes, with hair color ranging from black to white and all shades in between. So congratulations to you. Over to FDU at Madison for two questions from that end.
Hi. Obviously, one of the major factors for so many, factors, reasons right now in the Middle East is the poverty rate and the unemployment being so high. Now, my question is what procedures and tactics should these new governments take to combat the poverty and the unemployment levels that they've just taken over in their countries?
Second question.
You said that this was a leaderless, that all of them were like leaderless protests, and I was just wondering if you think that there's a chance that some leader from the opposition could use this in order to create in order to have the people who protest now to follow him, because he sees this opportunity in the leaderless protests. I'm not sure if you understand what I'm asking. So, because usually most of the protests have a leader, so and since there's none, that somebody could use this to become a new leader and push them in either direction.
Thank you. The first question I'd like you to take, but I want to add a supplementary to that. We have a situation of a large number of countries with huge populations, all of which are young and getting no jobs. This is not a minor problem. How do you create jobs in developing countries when the people without jobs are not just 5% of the total or 10% of the total, but 50% of the total population? And so it's a gigantic problem that is in front of us. And the question then requires some sort of dramatic solution in which the answer cannot be found by the developing countries alone, but in which we have to, all of us, developed and developing, take off our shirts, roll up our sleeves, and take off our coats, and roll up our sleeves, because if you take off your shirt, there's no sleeve left to roll, and then resolve the problem. But on the second question, which is leaderless, my understanding is that what is happening is a genuine revolution. All revolutions ultimately come to an end. That is the story of revolutions. We've seen them in the United States, in France, in China, in Iran, in a dozen other countries. Revolutions go through different phases, including a phase of terror and a phase in which somebody just pops up, a Napoleon pops up and tries to take over. But ultimately, they end. And so we have to welcome revolutions, because revolutions ultimately bring a new status quo which is more democratic in exchange for a status quo which is based on the divine right of kings to do no wrong. And so revolutions are good. Back to you, sir.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. The fact that the revolution is leaderless in Egypt or in the other Arab countries is not a bad thing. After all, as I said in my first introduction, you get a person like Obama. 10 years ago, nobody would have thought that Obama would be the president of the United States. But the conditions were there. The Bush administration and the Iraq war and everything. And he came up. So through this revolution, when you set up a government and you start elections, you start campaigning, some people, perhaps one of the young ones that was on the streets of Cairo, or a group of them, can come up with a party. And they also invite some other people that were silent before, but they are not in the military, that are able, and they can take over to start with, and then a leader eventually, or leaders will evolve. We don't necessarily need a leader. In Europe, every 4 years you have a different prime minister. Some of them are successful, some are not successful. But the government goes on, and you have democracy flourishing. Very rarely they get important leaders, like de Gaulle, for example, in Europe. But the important thing is for democracy through consensus and cooperation, through multi-party system, develop and take decisions for people. And that leads me to the other question, unemployment. How do you solve the question of unemployment? As Badr Kamal said, this is an enormous problem and cannot perhaps be solved by the countries themselves. Although the most important factor should be the country itself.
No, I don't agree with you there. I cannot agree with you that this is something which can be done by the countries themselves. They have no money. There is absolutely no money in these developing countries. This is the standard argument used by the rich countries to try to palm off the problem of their role onto that of the developing countries. The problem is that of the developed countries who have not played the game over the past 100 years. And so I cannot absolve you of the crime that you have committed of eating all the money through colonialism and other means and exploitation of the developing countries. And you are a person who is responsible for the absence of jobs until today. So don't try to get out of your responsibility, sir.
I'm glad that you made that, and then I take the satisfaction of solving the problem and being the savior of humanity. No, we are being sarcastic here. We shouldn't be. No, I mentioned the most important factor should be the countries themselves, and I repeat that because it has to be their solution and not a solution imposed from outside. Because unfortunately, most aid from outside the third world was tied to buying from the country or giving them certain privileges, no taxation, or etc., etc. But there must be, and here I agree with you, a concerted, and I mentioned that before in my previous statement, there must be a concerted effort by all developed countries, the United States, and I said before, unfortunately they are talking about reducing foreign aid, and Europe, maybe working together, or through the UN, or through other regional organizations, to pour as much money for the development of these countries, and not just for making sure, and spending a lot of money, making sure that oil comes through and helping huge, rich companies make more and more money through that effort only.
Over to T-Neck for 2 questions from that end.
My name is Mark Martirana, and I'm a student of political science and a member of the Global Scholars Program. I wanted to ask if you could talk about the role that Al Jazeera has played in countering government-sponsored media and fostering a sense of pan-Arab solidarity that transcends borders and creates unity between the pro-democracy protesters throughout the Arab world.
My name is Joshua Kleiman. I'm a political science minor. You were talking about America helping to promote democracy in Egypt and Tunisia, where the governments have already failed. How much help should there be without providing too much anti-American sentiment for other groups that are out there?
I'd like to take the first one and then you take the second one. One of the most important events in the Muslim world over the past 50 years was the growth of Nasserism in Egypt. Nasser was an extraordinary figure. Extraordinary because he had a vision, and his vision was that of pan-Arabism. In other words, of a sort of an extension of Arab thought, not Egyptian thought, not Saudi thought, not Libyan thought, but Arab thought, Arab nationality. Now, this concept of pan-Arab nationality was a fascinating concept, and many people did not like it because it would ultimately have resulted in replacing the Ottoman Empire by an Arab empire, meaning that you would have had a huge superpower in the Arab world controlling obviously almost 60 to 70% of the world's oil. And that could not be allowed because it endangered the preeminence of other countries, particularly in the West. And so pan-Arabism, despite the efforts of Nasser, particularly with trying to team up with Syria, etc., in what was called the Arab Republic, United Arab Republic, that all this died out, and Nasser was replaced by Sadat. And Sadat's great function was to replace pan-Arabism by Egyptianism, or nationality, state nationality, as opposed to pan-Arab nationality. Now, the question that you have asked is linked to Nasserism, because what Al Jazeera has done is to transcend. Al Jazeera is an organization set up in Qatar, but it is no longer a Qatar organization. It has become an Arab organization, and it is widely watched in the Arab world. And one of the great ironies is that this television channel, which is so widely watched throughout the Arab world, and which has by far the best coverage of events in Tunisia and Egypt and Bahrain and Libya, is not being allowed to be transmitted in the United States. Its coverage in the United States is limited to just 2 states out of the 50 in the United States. And so there is an odd, disguised, quote unquote, censorship which is taking place in order to prevent Al Jazeera from being watched in the United States. Why is that so? I think it is linked to your question, that pan-Arabism is not something that we swallow or stomach easily in the United States. We want separate nation states, and therefore we do not want transcendental Arabism to become a sort of a emerging superpower in the Middle East. I'd like you to take the next question, which is anti-Americanism. Is the anti-Americanism because people don't like the United States, or because people do not like US policies in the region?
Well, I think your question is answered by the question itself, the second part of the question. Yeah, I think people are not against the United States. They are against certain policies of the United States, certain policies relating to them. For example, supporting the regimes that they disliked, or supporting the continuation, or not helping enough for the solution of the Palestinian issue that we said before, is very fundamental to all the Arab states. So, in trying to tackle the present situation as it develops, you are right that the United States is trying to make sure that they don't foster more anti-Americanism. If anything, they would have liked, for example, if a flag or a few American flags were on the streets in Cairo and Tunisia, and they could have been, if the United States made an equivocal statement in favor of the revolution. But of course, as I said before, they had to go through a balancing act because it was very difficult to decide what was going on and how they would affect it without jeopardizing their whole enterprise and their interests themselves. So they have to take into consideration whenever they do not to take positions that would antagonize more people against the United States. So the more they come out in favor of the revolution and the results of the revolution, and their readiness to help in the reconstruction of the countries, but not too early so that people would say you are coming to buy us off, but at a particular time and through perhaps international organizations or cooperatively together with Europe, that would be the important thing to do and avoid having more anti-Americanism. Coming back to Nasserism that you mentioned before, let me add a word. I remember being a young diplomat coming to the United Nations in the 60s. And saw that Egypt was the most important country to follow at the United Nations because Nasser put Egypt on the map, not only because of his Pan-Arabism, but also for his non-aligned movement that was including all the Arab states, but also some the Africans and Asian countries. And therefore, it was very important for any diplomat at the UN to watch and see what Egypt was doing. If you had to have a resolution go through the General Assembly and sometimes through the Security Council as well, when Egypt was a member of the Security Council, you had to talk and get the support of the Egyptian delegation. They were indeed the leader of the Arab world. That, of course, faded after Nasser disappeared and the policy of Egypt has changed. That was very important and very dramatic, and I lived through it and throughout the 60s.
We're at the end of our session, but I would like to express my feeling of great honor at seeing Professor Rafalidis himself taking charge of this entire video session. And because of that, if you, sir, if you have a question, we will go over time in order to answer your question from your end.
Challenge.
Well, I do have a question, and it is one which concerns the idea of the relationship between Bahrain and Saudi Arabia. Since there is a large Shiite population adjacent to the coastal region, and I'm wondering whether this does send a signal to the Saudis for some kind of change within their regime.
Let me take this because having lived in Saudi Arabia for 6 years, I think I'm slightly more familiar with the problems of the population. Saudi Arabia faces 2 or 3 types of problems. The first is that it has a relatively small population, but which is largely tribal in character. And in the south, it has Yemen, which is a much older country than Saudi Arabia, and where the tribes have an older history. And so there has always been an intellectual push from Yemen into Saudi Arabia. And some of that push has resulted in reactions to the Saudi government in the past. So there have been revolts in the past in the southern part of Saudi Arabia because of the Yemeni tribesmen who are who have more history in their DNA than do the people of Saudi Arabia themselves. Number two, Saudi Arabia is a Muslim country and it is a monarchy. And the two are incompatible. They are incompatible because Islam believes in democracy and does not believe in monarchy. And therefore, the fact that it is a monarchy gives it a certain tenuousness in the permanence of and the strength of the government. Now, the government has been very successful in sharing wealth with the population and in having a good alliance with the leaders of the Islamic parties in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is unusual because the king has 2 cabinet meetings every week, one with the royal family on Mondays and one with the religious leaders on Wednesdays. And so there is an effort to have an alliance between secular and religious forces, but the fact remains that for an average Muslim in the street, there is an incompatibility between the vision of Islam as a democratic state and the vision of a monarchy which is obviously not democratic but hereditary. And so there is tenuousness in Saudi Arabia. Now that is going to be affected by Bahrain. Bahrain is linked, it is next door, and if things begin going wrong in Jordan, as they went wrong in Iran and now in Bahrain and then in Yemen, then I'm afraid Saudi Arabia is going to be surrounded by problems on all sides. And so I would imagine that they have some sleepless nights in Saudi Arabia these days. You don't agree? Oh,
no, I agree 100%. I don't
why
have.
Do you shake your head?
I mean, very good. I mean, you analyze the situation very well. You know the problem because, as you say, you lived there for 6 years. So I have nothing to add to that.
In that case, may I request you, Professor Rafalidis, to close this session from your end.
I'd like to thank you for this interesting presentation. Our students have learned much from this discussion and are taking with them a wealth of information and insight. This entire presentation will appear on our global learning website. Ambassadors, thank you very much. And I'd like to remind everyone of our next conference, which is April 12th, Democracy and Strife in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you.